Hello and welcome to Strat News Global. And welcome to The Gist, our flagship show on foreign affairs and security. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and I'd like to introduce my guests from overseas. First of all, we have Anit Mukherjee from Singapore. He is at the Rajarathnam School of International Studies, where he teaches international relations. He's a former Indian Army officer. We also have from Canberra in Australia, James Goldrick, formerly of the Royal Australian Navy. He is currently adjunct professor in, I think, maritime studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, let me first begin with Anit Mukherjee. We are looking at the issue of the sinking of the Indonesian submarine last week. And Anit Mukherjee, you were at the Rajarathnam School. You teach a lot of Indonesian scholars from the military and otherwise. I understand you have met the commander of the submarine, Colonel Octavian.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I do teach over here. I don't teach a lot of Indonesian colleagues, but I do have a few Indonesians. I was also privileged to have Colonel Harry Octavian in my class. He was in my class in 2014, 2015. And so, yes, it was a sad day for all of us when we found out that he is no more. And he was the captain of that ship, of that submarine.
Generally, what, you get a lot of Indonesian coming across. But I'm just trying to gauge, professionally, how do you regard them, their capabilities, their training?
We get about 10 to 15% of our students are from Indonesia, and they're really, really good at their work, and especially the officers from the Indonesian Armed Forces. We have about 3 to 5 of them every year, and they're at the top of their batch. So overall, very good capabilities, very hardworking, and they bring a lot to the table.
James Goldrick, I believe the Australian Navy has a fairly close relationship with the Indonesian Navy. Could you tell us something about its capabilities, the size of the Navy, how modern it is in current day terms?
Well, the Indonesian Navy really has what you could see as two components. One is a deterrent force, which does include the submarines and their most modern surface combatants, which of course are missile armed. But in addition to that, they have an extensive maritime security and logistics support role around the huge archipelago. It's a Navy that really has to make the best use of the resources it gets. It is resource constrained, but it is very professional, and I think increasingly professional, and is acquiring some fairly sophisticated equipment. Indeed, also through an indigenous building program, both of surface ships, so they've been doing that for some time, but of course the latest submarine, which ironically only commissioned last month, is an evolution of the design of the Nanggala. It's a German design, but South Korean evolved. And this submarine was actually assembled at PT PAL in Surabaya with South Korean assistance, but in Indonesia.
Is it normal, Professor Goldrick, for a 50-year-old submarine to be at sea carrying out torpedo drills?
Well, to be fair, Nanggala was 40 years old. She commissioned in 1981, and she has had a number of what are called full cycle dockings ever since, which is when the submarine is zero life as far as can be. I believe it's sometime since she had her last full cycle docking refit, and that may have been an issue. 40 years is a long time for a submarine. But I think it's the full cycle docking and the continuing maintenance that is also key. So it would be something that you'd be watching very closely, but not necessarily saying that submarine has to be taken out of service. What I am sure of is the Indonesian Navy will be looking very closely at at Nanggala's sister ship, Kakra, which was a month older. She was also commissioned in 1981. I believe she's been refitted much more recently, but I would expect the Indonesian Navy will be very carefully looking at the material state of that boat.
Mm-hmm. Anit Mukherjee, we've gone through this before, the sinking of a kilo-class submarine in Mumbai Harbour, and the enormous issues involved in terms of getting to that submarine, salvaging it. It took some months, really. Um, in that sense, is your region better equipped? Because I understand the Singapore Navy was also involved in the search and rescue, search and salvage operation.
Yes, it was involved in the search operations. It's the salvage operations is the one under question. But first, I think we should start with the admission that comparing the Indian submarine accident and this one it's very, very different. In that case, that sunk in
Yeah.
harbor, so it is easier to salvage. Here, it is almost 800 meters under the sea. So this is going to be an entirely different challenge of entirely different scope and extremely expensive to do. So I don't think we should be able to make that comparison. But in terms of whether they'll be able to salvage it, I think it'll take enormous expenditure of resources. I'm not a submariner myself. I think James is better handled to take on this question, actually.
James, what do you say about this?
I would agree completely. It's the complete salvage of the boat is possible. Equivalent salvage has been done before, but it would be extremely expensive. And as I've written recently, I think the better course will probably be to do a very close examination using the same sort of capabilities that the Singaporean rescue ship deployed, to do a video examination of the wreck site, and then possibly recover some components if those will help in trying to work out what happened. But you're thinking of hundreds of millions of dollars, in my opinion, if you try to do a complete salvage. And frankly, it's a terrible tragedy. There are 53 dead, and to be sure of the cause is important. But I think there's also a question of what's the wise allocation of resources. And I think in this case, the living would be better served if that sort of money is made available to continue to work on having the Indonesian submarine fleet as efficient and as safe as possible.
Surya,
I
if I can
understand the
ask,
submarine didn't have an escape. Yeah.
Surya, sorry,
Anit, go
sorry.
ahead.
No, I thought if I could ask a question of James, because I thought I'll take
Yeah, sure, go
advantage
ahead.
of this. James, do you think we
Go
could
ahead.
ever face the fact that we might never actually find out, why exactly the submarine did sink?
I think it's quite possible that they will never be completely sure, because of the nature of the implosion after the submarine passed its crush depth. So it would be very difficult to tell. I suspect if you're looking very closely at KRI, and if a fault was revealed, a fault in terms of metal fatigue or structural problems, you might be able to say that's the most likely cause. But I believe it's quite possible they will never be completely sure.
Okay. Thank you, Surya. Sorry, I didn't mean to appropriate your role.
Yeah, Professor, the fact that it didn't have an escape module, I understand most of these German submarines come with escape module. We in India have it, but this one apparently didn't have one.
That's for James, right?
Yeah, James.
I understand. My understanding of the design is that although the Type 209 is a generic design, it has evolved over many years. The first two Indonesian boats are what's called the Type 209 1300, which refers to the displacement. But they're an earlier vintage, and I don't think they had that escape capsule fitted to the original design, whereas I think later versions of the Type 209, and I think that may include the Indian navies, do.
Professor, one thing struck me, the fact that if you look back in the case of India, we had submarines in service, but we got a deep submergence rescue vessel only much later, after the disaster in Mumbai Harbour. Do navies tend to, place more emphasis on the offensive platform, less on the, support systems necessary to ensure that in case something goes wrong, there's something which can move in at early enough to carry out any rescue?
I think James again. I think he'd be better.
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, he can. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you. So is that for me or for James? Sorry.
No, this is for James. Professor,
right.
I find that navies, like in the case of the Indian Navy, they had an offensive platform like a submarine, but they settled on a rescue vessel much later after the disaster in Mumbai Harbour. Is this something which the navies tend to kind of overlook?
It's not necessarily overlooked. It's often a very difficult bargain, particularly as it is often harder to get governments to pay for the less glamorous, apparently less frontline elements of any kind of capability. And that will include, for instance, all the logistics, stores, support, spares, and so on that will be needed. So I think that there is an element of accepting a risk, but to gain a capability that obviously is very important in naval terms, particularly as a deterrent, because once you have a submarine, any would-be aggressor immediately has to think about it. And that sort of bargain, I think, and that sort of decision is having to be made all the time. I would say it's the sort of thing that governments need to understand, that if they want to have this sort of capability, then they need to understand all the stuff that needs to be behind it if it's going to be properly resourced and run properly. And I'm acutely aware of just how many demands on the Indian Navy there are, and the extent to which the Indian Navy has to make hard choices in order to have all the capabilities it's got. Australia is, the Australian Navy is in a, has similar decisions to make all the time. And of course, the Indonesian Navy does as well. What happened in this circumstance was that, of course, the international agreements and the work that navies have done together to cooperate in terms of emergency functioned, extraordinarily well. I mean, I'm particularly impressed by the speed of the Indonesian Navy's initial reaction. They did not delay in announcing they had a problem and in calling on assistance. And then, of course, the speed with which Singapore was able to deploy its submarine rescue vessel. And of course, other navies were assisting. I think the Indian Navy's submarine rescue vessel would have only been a few days behind, and Australia was sent a frigate and a tanker to help with the search. And I think an American P-8 was deployed, and Malaysia sent assets. So that all happened quite fast. And I think it worked remarkably well. I mean, I think they also were fortunate probably in the sense that turned out that the submarine's wreckage was quite close to where they thought it had last reported in. So they found it quite quickly, whereas the Argentinian submarine, also of this sort of German stable, which was lost in 2017, they took about a year to find it.
Mm-hmm. And Anit Mukherjee, can you tell me something about the submarine capabilities in Southeast Asia? You mentioned Singapore sending a submerged rescue vessel. I presume they have submarines in service. What about the others?
I'm not really good at this. I think Vietnam has some. Myanmar just got one on loan from India. It feels like I'm on a test here. I think James would be much better qualified to actually take on that question.
Okay, James Goldrick.
I'll certainly do what I can. Of course, Singapore has a very efficient and submarine fleet. It's worked with the Swedes, and I think more recently, of course, with new build German boats. And Singapore certainly has approached its development of its submarine fleet in a very systematic way. Vietnam has 6 Russian-built Kilo-class submarines, which, again, it seems to have had a very systematic approach, and they're all operational. India, of course, has transferred one of its Russian-built Kilo-class to Myanmar. Bangladesh has 2 very simple, quite old, renovated Chinese submarines of the, I think, called the Ming type. Malaysia has 2 French-built modern boats, which, of course, operate in the South China Sea. Thailand has a Chinese boat on order. It's had to suspend an order for 2 more. Those are more modern boats than Bangladesh operates. So submarines are very much the system of choice for navies. And again, it's that point about the uncertainty, the deterrent factor they create. If you are a would-be aggressor, life becomes very much more difficult as soon as your target has a submarine.
Mm-hmm. Professor, Given the challenges before, in terms of the Chinese muscle flexing in the South China Sea, uh, do you believe that is the Indonesian Navy on a program of modernization? Are they getting new vessels, upgrading training procedures? What can you tell us?
They certainly are on a program of modernisation, although I do make the point that they continue to be very constrained by the resources available. The submarine fleet, for many years, they maintained the 2 submarines as the core of their deterrent force. Very recently, that has come up, and it was 2 new commissionings in South Korea in 2017 and 2018, and of course last month the Indonesian built boat. So they're left with 4 submarines, but that's 2 more than they had for many years. And of course, 3 of them are practically brand new. Similarly, they have now a force of very modern frigates and corvettes built in Indonesia, missile armed and with some pretty good sensors. So they are trying to improve and modernize the Navy, while of course they have a lot of continuing responsibilities, for the vast archipelago of Indonesia. So what I would say is I think there's growing capability, and of course with that I think can come growing confidence. This accident will be a real blow, I think, to the Indonesian Navy, and they'll have to work hard to recover morale. Any Navy gets hit very hard by an accident like this. But certainly if I look at the progress the Indonesian Navy's made in the last decade, considering the constraints they've been operating under, it's pretty impressive.
Anit, would you like to take this question on? The fact that given Chinese pressure in the Natuna's areas and all, Indonesia has been curiously reluctant to make it an issue. They seem to be playing it down. Why is this so?
I think you could argue that every country wants to play down issues of tension with, let's say, a great power which is immediately kind of next door, right? I mean, you could make the argument that Indians were playing down our differences with China over the last 10 years. Whether it was Doklam or immediately after, you could say that even after Doklam, we were playing down the tensions and the disagreements that we have with China along the LOC, because along the LAC, sorry, because I think it's in the interest of countries to try and work through diplomacy first. And so Indonesia is behaving like any other great power, as any other power does, which is trying the diplomatic approach to try and see if they can solve the problem. But I think it's also indicative of the concerns they have about the growth of Chinese military power and its assertiveness, that they are investing in the naval arm in a significant way, as James has been talking about it. I think if we were to take an estimate about trends over time, then I would imagine that in the next 5 to 10 years, despite this tragedy, they will still invest more in building up their ships, their submarines, and other elements of the naval power.
Professor, the Indonesians have been rather cool to the Quad, isn't it? Not that they've got an invitation or something of that kind, but they have been kind of cool about the Quad.
Yes, and I think it's already, in the comments already made, really reflects Indonesia's care to be seen to be maintaining its traditional approach to alliances, and indeed to being seen as acting in its own interests to moderate situations. I don't think that'll mean that Indonesia won't be happy case by case to cooperate with members of the Quad on activities that are of mutual benefit. But I do think it is wary about anything that looks like a multilateral military alliance. As indeed, I think, to be fair, the members of the Quad seem to be trying hard to make sure that it isn't being seen only as a military alliance. So I'm not really surprised by Indonesia's reaction to it. Indonesia is trying to handle China with care. Indonesia doesn't want to have trouble with China. Indeed, I find it astounding that China has started trouble with Indonesia in the Natunas. I find that totally against China's geostrategic interests to do that to Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia, frankly, wants a peaceful existence.
And Professor, do you see, the bilateral engagement between the Australian Navy and the Indonesian Navy? How does this shape up?
I certainly hope it will continue, because, of course, we have many challenges of mutual security. I mean, it's totally in Australia's interest for Indonesia to be prosperous, stable, free, for it to have excellent maritime security. So anything we can do to help and to cooperate with them, we will. And indeed, there's a lot of engagement, both on the Navy to Navy and indeed Coast Guard to our border force, to our Maritime Border Command on that issue. And of course, we do provide a great deal of training. And again, to back up the earlier comment, I would say that we find the Indonesian students very impressive, and working very hard and really trying to get as much as they can out of what Australia is providing. So I think it's a relationship that's continuing to develop, and I hope it continues to strengthen, because Indonesia is our, with Papua New Guinea, our closest major neighbour.
Yeah. Anit Mukherjee, India and Indonesia, there's been some moves towards ramping up military engagement. There's even talk of us developing Sabang port. Can you tell us something about this?
Yes, thank you. I think we haven't fulfilled the potential of our engagement as much as we can. And I think the best way to take advantage of that is the Andaman and the Nicobar Islands. I mean, we are practically kind of next door to each other. I know that if you look at Stratpost, it has done a special series on Andaman and the Nicobar Islands. I think it makes complete sense for us to invest more on the military to military engagement across different institutions, in the field of education, in the field of training. And so I think it is a growth industry. I think there is a lot of potential for it, but why hasn't it happened as yet is something that I'm not in a position to answer.
And Sabang port, do you have any information on that?
Nothing much specific, actually. I don't know the specifics of that. James probably might know a bit more about it.
Professor, would you like to weigh in here?
Not about that latter issue, but I certainly agree that I think India and Indonesia have a lot to do with each other. And I also think, with the Andaman and Nicobars, I think this maritime domain awareness, maritime security, developing a shared picture, sharing information, both dynamically and in the long term. And frankly, if Australia can come in on that, if you can have a trilateral arrangement for maritime domain awareness, given the extent to which the three of us together encompass a great deal of the Northeast Indian Ocean region.
Yeah.
That I think is the sort of thing that we ought to be doing. I've argued before that I'd like to see more maritime aircraft patrols, which are sharing information, and indeed perhaps operating, forward basing. Operating in each other's countries. I mean, there is a precedent in the Australian Gateway patrols, which the Australian Air Force have been running for Malaysia, with Malaysia over many years, and with Malaysian personnel embarked in the appropriate flights. And I think that's an indication of both sharing information, but also developing trust and connections.
Mm-hmm. And do you see some kind of moves towards a trilateral cooperation taking shape?
I don't know the specifics of that sort of thing, but I certainly know that there wouldn't be any objection to it. And I do know that there is work going on that issue, but I don't know the specifics of how much it's become a trilateral as opposed to bilateral in the two directions. But I certainly think we've all, the three countries have a great deal more to say to each other about these sort of shared security problems, which of course have dimensions which are much wider than military ones, in terms of dealing with transnational crime, drug smuggling, with illegal fishing, with potential people smuggling, all these sort of things. It's more than just a military thing. And frankly, although China is, always the elephant in the room, it really isn't completely about China.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean, sir? Can you tell us? Can you explain? You said it's not just about China.
Well, because the thing is, we all have these requirements to understand what's going on in our maritime domains. And, you know, a lot goes on that is not legal and is undesirable. And the more dynamic a picture we can have, and the more complete our picture can be, the better our law enforcement can be, the safer it is to operate at sea, the better environmental controls can be applied, and so on and so on. So there's this whole, I mean, I dislike the expression non-traditional because from a naval point of view, a lot of this is very traditional, smuggling, piracy, and so on. But it is not state on state or state rivalry issues. It's actually shared state problems. And frankly, we don't know what's going on nearly as much as often people think we do, because I think everybody has a James Bond idea of, you know, some seeing eye that can tell who you are and what's the flavor of drink you're drinking. It's a lot more complicated than that, and a lot goes on. An MH370, the lost Malaysian flight, indicated the sort of problem you have that we're not really as sure about as we should be.
The last word from both of you. How do you see things shaping up, say, over the next 3 to 5 years in the region where you are? You know, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, India. How do you see the challenges coming up? Are these going to increase? Are we going to see greater cooperation between the littoral states? Anit Mukherjee?
Thank you so much for that question. Firstly, I wanted to say something about James' idea of a trilateral cooperation. I think that's an excellent idea. I can't think of a better place than Andaman to host such a trilateral meeting, right? I mean, Australia, India, Indonesia, and I think India should take part of that sort of a idea to open up the Andamans to greater foreign military cooperation, as well as engagement across the region. I don't think we're taking full advantage of our Andaman, of the location of the Andaman Nicobar Islands. Now, to go back to your question about what are the future holds and what would we see. Firstly, I'm not a fortune teller, so I'm not really good with predictive questions, but I do think we will see elements of both cooperation and competition. The ASEAN is not comfortable with the idea of the Quad. We still don't know what the Quad really is. I think there's all sorts of descriptions from an Asian NATO, which I think is an overblown idea, to, you know, other arguments that it's just a vehicle for a multilateral cooperation. I think the Quad, give it some time, we will know a little bit more about the Quad, but there will be elements of cooperation. There'll be elements of competition also. I think Indonesia, as it grows economically, will have to invest in its navy, and that will create opportunities for India to cooperate with that country. So I would imagine we'll see a lot more of the same. There'll be some competitive elements, there will be some cooperative elements, and in the meantime, all the countries in this region will continue to modernize their militaries. What that portends for the future is anybody's guess.
Professor, last word from you.
I think I'd agree with Anit's uncertainty about things. I think I would absolutely agree with his general approach. The only thing I would add is I think much will depend on the extent to which China moderates its behavior. And I think its approach to Indonesia over the Natunas is indicative of where I think it's misplacing its priorities. You know, there are real problems for doing that for China for the purposes of domestic consumption and so on, is how they manage it. But I think an important part will be the extent to which China itself cooperates or confronts. And the final thing is, let's not forget the potential for natural disasters, which may or may not be triggered by climate change, as the Christmas Day tsunami of many years ago indicated. Catastrophe can happen without notice, and it can have very significant strategic effects and require enormous resources. And of course, you know, and I do feel for India at the moment, the current pandemic is another example of how something can happen, which really changes all priorities and how things need to be dealt with.
Good point. Anit Mukherjee, James Goldrick, pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you again very much for talking to Strat News Global and appearing on our show, The Gist. Thank you
Thank
again.
you for having me.
Thank you so much.